the Cold War has never really ended.
This is a very racist.
To stop the federal government from investing in new weapon systems.
Most of the mining comes from Canada.
Under the Indian Act.
Again, snipers.
Shame, Justin Trudeau!
Grocery store.
Soaked in the blood of Ryan.
The revolution will not be won with hot takes. Welcome to the Red Review.
Hey comrades, it's Daniel here. Welcome to another episode of the Red Review, but today we are doing something different. Recently, Emily and I were guests on a Comrades radio show. Chris Wanamaker is the host of the Open Mic, a literary journey into words, on local 107.3 FM in St. John's, New Brunswick. We spoke about an article I wrote called Capitalism is the Virus, and we connected that with Emily's unionizing experience at Wilfrid Laurier University. So the title of this podcast episode is Capitalism is the Virus and Unionizing is the Vaccine. But first, both Emily and I work and live on stolen Indigenous land on Turtle Island, and all members of Socialist Action live and work on stolen Indigenous land. So we echo the call for land back, and we demand that there can be no reconciliation without restitution, and that includes seizing the assets of the major resource developers and returning it to the commons. So before we get into this interview that we recorded, and which has been aired a few times in St. John's, I wanted to just break down the title a little bit more. Capitalism is the virus, unionizing is the vaccine. And I think it fits because unionization, just like vaccination, is not the be-all end-all. Vaccination cannot stop this pandemic, and we've seen that because the virus mutates around it, especially if we let the virus proliferate unchecked. In the same way, unions provide workers a means to negotiate with the bosses as a class and to win gains. But as the global economy changes around us, we see union leadership becoming bureaucratic, becoming stagnant, and refusing to mobilize to win gains for the workers in this period of neoliberalism. That does not mean we do away with unions. Just like the reduced efficacy of vaccines in the situation of a mutating virus does not mean we do away with vaccines in general. It means we need to revitalize our union movement. It means we need to not neglect other means of organizing workers. And it means we need to keep pushing for the ultimate prize, that of a society run by the exploited and the oppressed, a society where each according to their needs, from each according to their ability, rings true as an anthem. So I really hope you enjoy this discussion where Emily and I play the role of discussant, and Chris Wanamaker, our dear comrade in New Brunswick, gets to play host. And as a special treat, at the end of this interview, you can hear Emily's rendition of a union classic. So the whole thing, it's a hoot, I swear.
The Open Mic.
The open mic.
Welcome to the program. I'm Chris Wanamaker, and we have today guests that we have never had on our program before, and I'm so pleased to have them on today. I have Daniel Terade and Emily Steers. Daniel lectures in the life sciences at both the University of Toronto and Toronto Metropolitan University. He obtained his Bachelor of Arts in Science in 2015 with a major in biochemistry and a minor in communication, media, and film from the University of Windsor. What a unique combination of studies. In 2021, Daniel successfully defended his PhD. Wow! In the Department of Laboratory, Medicine, and Pathobiology at the University of Toronto, where he specialized in the biochemistry and structural biology of oxygen-sensing proteins and published numerous peer-reviewed articles as lead author. We're going to hear some of his writing today. Daniel plays a leading role in the Socialist Action Party and the Workers' Action Movement, where he ran for Secretary-Treasurer at the 2021 Ontario Federation of Labour Convention. As a member of the Labour Forward slate, he regularly writes on the philosophy of science and socialism for Socialist Action. What credentials you have, Daniel, they're very impressive, but also impressive are the credentials of Emily Steers. Emily joins us on this program as well. She's a community musician based in Guelph, Ontario, and she's involved in local organizing. She recently was involved in a successful union organizing effort at Wilfrid Laurier University. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, Chris. I'm excited to be here.
Much.
Welcome, Emily. Welcome, Daniel. And Daniel, we're going to start off with this essay that you have recently written and published. It's a bit on the academic side, but it says some very interesting things about capitalism and what capitalism is and how it spreads. And Daniel, I'm going to leave it up to you to take it away. If you can read this very interesting but somewhat academic paper, if you could read it very slowly so we can follow it.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. The virology of capitalism. Capitalism is killing you. That was the photo that we put with it. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, socialists insist that capitalism is the virus. Such a phrase is not a casual flip of the script or a whataboutism. Popular discourse surrounding virology and epidemiology simply accounts for capitalist rhetoric. Neoliberals apply concepts of natural selection and survival of the fittest to viruses, to humans, to businesses, to ideas, and to our capitalist economy. By picking at these threads, the slogan, capitalism is the virus, becomes more analytical. Simultaneously, we critique capitalism by highlighting how the material conditions it fosters prompts pandemics and how the solution is socialism.
There's a lot in that first paragraph, Daniel. Yeah. You could elaborate on that, I imagine, for hours. You condense so much into that paragraph. What struck me is that it sounds like you are looking at capitalism as a virus, as an infection, as something that's spreading that is not good for the human race. And yet we're surrounded by capitalism. We live in it. We breathe in it. It's everywhere. Capitalism is the society in which we live, and people have defended it and have even fought wars and died for it. So for you to say capitalism is a virus might come as a surprise to some people, but maybe you can elaborate.
There's this funny anecdote, again, from an epidemiology background, where it took a very long time to establish a link between smoking cigarettes and lung cancer. And in hindsight, it seems so obvious. You had this very precipitous increase in lung cancer rates. Lung cancer used to be a very rare form of cancer historically, and then all of a sudden became one of the more common forms. And yet, no one suspected a link with cigarettes at the beginning because everybody smoked. It was so ubiquitous that the quote, and I'm paraphrasing here, and I also forget which epidemiologist to attribute it to, but that's okay. They said that it would have been just the same to imagine that nylon stockings were causing cancer because of how ubiquitous it is. And I think that's the same situation with capitalism. For the majority of people on this planet, they've lived and worked their whole lives under a capitalist system. So it seems entirely natural. And that's one of the purposes behind writing an article like this, is to try and find an angle at approaching capitalism that will hopefully be able to illuminate it for what it is.
It seems to me that you're talking about something that a lot of people don't talk about in everyday conversation. And I'm thinking that if I were a fish and I lived in an ocean and I was surrounded by the water, I wouldn't really think that there was any such thing as dry land. And and maybe every once in a while as a fish, I would fly up into the air, but I'd fly right back down into the water again. I wouldn't really get much of a glance at the land or the sky, maybe a little bit, but it's kind of like that, like we're surrounded by capitalism. And if you're saying that capitalism is a virus, again, this doesn't sound very good. It sounds like you might be a bit ahead of your time. Can you read a little bit more of your essay for us?
Absolutely. Throughout history, viruses and bacteria, tuberculosis, pneumonia, smallpox, polio, measles, influenza, cholera, etc., killed more humans than anything else. It is only recently, in the last 50 to 100 years, that chronic diseases like cancer and heart disease killed more people than infectious diseases in the global north, and life expectancy has soared from around 50 years to 80 years of age. This dramatic shift is commonly attributed to scientific and technological advances like the discovery of antibiotics, which entered clinical practice in 1942, and widespread vaccination programs that became common around the same time. By extension, these advances are credited to capitalism, the free market of ideas, and competition between corporations for profit. Although a tempting hypothesis, this relationship is not borne out in the data.
So, Daniel, what do you mean by the free market of ideas? I guess some people would say that if ideas are competing against one another, then the best ideas will win that competition. And that explains why, apparently, supposedly, capitalism has been so successful in advancing science. But you disagree.
If I may jump in, having an open marketplace of ideas and allowing the ideas to, compete with one another for which one is superior, that assumes that all ideas are on the same footing and have the same ideological supports and the same motivations for their advancement. We can all think of ideas that are winning in the so-called marketplace of ideas because they have backing, because they have funding, because it serves a particular interest. So I am very leery of the idea of the marketplace of ideas because it's not necessarily the best ideas that win out, because the best ideas are often very complicated, very difficult to understand, very difficult to grasp, or very deeply unpopular.
Yeah, may I add that they might be just not as profitable. And with the free market of ideas, it does assume that everything's on equal footing. Emily gave a great explanation there. And so in the sciences, I got another anecdote from my time as a graduate student where I was in a seminar. This was the seminar given by the graduate student based on who had the quote unquote best paper of the year. So again, kind of fits that idea of the free market of ideas. This person had the best scientific advance out of us that year. And the science was cool. He was studying processes by which cells can recycle internal components. But you can see in capitalism that we're constantly evaluated based on our ability to make profit. And so even as a graduate student, this person presented on a link between this cellular process he was studying and a disease that's pretty common in sub-Saharan Africa known as kwashiorkor. It's a disease of protein deficiency. If you see the photos of children with the distended bellies, that's caused by this, where it might look like they're not malnourished because they do have a pretty full belly, but that's really actually from the decaying of the body and the swelling. And it's because they have a very deficient protein diet. So this student studied this, found out some of the pathways that are happening at the cellular level, but then proposed that they can develop a drug to treat this disease. And that was a moment for me where I started looking around in that lecture hall. Did anybody else hear this? They're proposing a pharmacological intervention for this disease when we all know that the cure is food. The best idea is that they need food. Peanut butter is a cure for this disease. But depending on the material conditions, depending on the economic system, the political system, certain ideas are invisible. And often the ideas that would help the most people are invisible. But the ideas that allow some people to advance beyond others and make more money, those are the ones that are the most visible. And it's very similar for how we tackle most problems in society, from the pandemic to other diseases. The solutions are the ones that are going to make the most money. Those are the only solutions that exist in capitalism. As I sometimes say, capitalism is a very efficient system, but the only way it evaluates its own efficiency is by profit. It is the best system in the world for maximizing profit. It is, but the thing is, profit is so often untethered to human need.
It sounds like the marketplace of ideas is not really free. It sounds like ideas are free. If you come up with an idea and you promote it, it sounds like that's, you're not paying to do that. In some respects, creativity might be free, but creativity also sounds like it's restricted. It's just permitted in certain areas. And especially if profit is involved, then that idea takes priority. And that seems to be what you're saying. What a great example, Daniel. Wow, that's mind-blowing. So that person was deemed to have the very best paper among a particular group of students then?
Yeah.
And
the biochemistry department at University of Toronto.
And was there ever a pharmacological intervention that that was developed as a result?
No.
No?
It's actually funny. Their presentation included a pretty heavy focus on this disease. By the time the paper was actually published, that was kind of dialed back there. And you can see the process by which everybody is incentivized to try and really broach the outer limits. What can we develop in terms of intellectual property? Because intellectual property is profitable. And so they even took a swing at developing intellectual property for a disease that could be cured by peanut butter. Just because it didn't make it there yet doesn't mean that it's not an example of how perverted the system is, if you will excuse my language there.
So you're right. People make money by coming up with ideas that are promoted by capitalism or endorsed by capitalism. Mm-hmm. So
capitalism is very good at selling you solutions to the problems it has created. A classic example would be Elon Musk and Tesla and the electric cars selling you these luxury items so that you can feel good about your climate impact because of the catastrophe that is human-caused climate change.
Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, it's not a very effective intervention at all. The solution isn't to get more cars on the road or to replace a subset of the cars on the road. It really does become branding at that point, marketing. That's mostly what pharmaceutical companies do as well, is just marketing and branding.
So capitalism seems to create needs, and then it tries to fulfill these needs through the market. Yep. But what you both seem to be suggesting is that the marketplace is not the best place to come up with the best ideas. You're kind of alluding to socialism as an alternative to capitalism, but we haven't gotten there yet with your essay, Daniel. So maybe you can continue.
Yeah, there's a few more examples coming up. Mortality due to tuberculosis already declined a full 90% from its peak in the mid-1800s before effective antibiotics entered clinical usage. 90%. Measles killed fewer and fewer people despite no change in incidence level before an effective vaccine in the 1960s caused the number of cases to plummet. So what was the cause of the decrease in infectious disease mortality in the years leading up to effective treatment and vaccines? Thomas McEwen, epidemiologist and historian of medicine, put forth a thesis in the 1960s that argues that increases in population in the 1800s resulted from increases in nutrition due to improving economic conditions. And this idea has since gained traction. What brought about improved nutrition? The Industrial Revolution, associated with more efficient agriculture and increased wealth generation, was necessary. Importantly, it was not sufficient. The first wave of the Industrial Revolution in the mid-1700s no doubt increased wealth for the ruling class in the global north, fueled by slavery and colonization of the global south. But for the working class of the global north, the Industrial Revolution produced the crowded, impoverished cities that spread tuberculosis. It took at least 50 years before the working class gained any significant increase in wages and living conditions. Why did wages increase? It is not a law of capitalism that real wages for the working class increase over the time. Quite the opposite. As rates of profit fall due to competition, workers get squeezed one way or another by outsourcing, automation, stagnating wages, layoffs/benefits. Instead, workers organized unions, fought for better wages, safer working conditions, and more democratic control. Mass organization, general strikes, and militancy redistributed some of the massive wealth accumulated in the early capitalist system. The resultant improvement in proletarian living conditions fostered resilience to pestilence and increased life expectancy in the global north, while colonization continued to fuel so-called tropical diseases in the global south. Today, the connection between poverty and mortality, the social determinants of health, is taught in medical school, but the relentless austerity endemic in the capitalist system, necessary to combat declines in the rate of profit and to keep the capitalist machine humming along, promotes and maintains the poverty and malnutrition that makes people susceptible to both infectious and chronic diseases.
So I think people confuse the workers' movement historically with the development of capitalism. It does sound like the two are obviously related, but they're different, right? Like just because society is a capitalist society doesn't mean that it produces benefits for workers. Workers really have to band together and fight and do whatever they can in order to achieve whatever benefits they can get, whether it's an 8-hour working day or vacation time or benefits for medical purposes, whatever those conditions might be that will increase their living standard, they really have to get together and organize and fight for. That seems to be what you're suggesting, is it not?
It is.
And Emily, you would be a good person to speak to this because you organized a union successfully. In my experience, that's very difficult. I had an experience one time when I just simply contacted a union representative to come into the workplace. And so the person did, and they spoke to a few of the workers. And immediately, in my casual job at that point, I didn't have any more work. My work vanished for some reason. And I've heard of other people who have been warned that if they even use the word union in the workplace, that they will no longer be able to work. Now, not all workplaces are that extreme. I worked at a college one time where we were permitted, actually allowed, to have union meetings during work time and to communicate with union members during that work time. And that was a unique experience in my life experience. But Emily, can you share how you went about organizing a union? I think it was for Wilfrid Laurier University, you said, right?
Yes. I was literally just reading, it was a short thing someone had shared online last week. My father would tell me stories about growing up. My grandfather was a coal miner, and my father would say, some years at Christmas, I'd get a toothbrush for my Christmas present, and then other years, I got a bike. So it was just so inconsistent. You never knew what the mine was going to be bringing in. And I shared that story with my grandmother a few years ago. And she said, you tell your father that the year he got a bicycle was the year we got a damn union.
Wow. Great story. Great story.
I'll have to track down that story online because I thought it was fantastic and see if we can link it in your show. But yeah, to my own experience with unionization, I will admit we had an easier time than most simply because of the situation we were in. TA unions are very, very common across Canada, and especially in Ontario, the vast majority of universities have teaching assistant unions. So graduate students who are employed by the university in a teaching role, assisting professors with grading, with lesson planning, with running lectures, with office hours, etc. They do really, really valuable work. And as we have seen from TA strikes, they are absolutely essential in the continual running of universities. So Wilfrid Laurier and University of Waterloo were the only two universities in Ontario that did not have a union. And that fact was reflected in our pay. At University of Toronto, for example, the standard TA wage is $45 an hour. And that wage, some might say that seems really high. And I will say it's not. They are asking for very, very skilled, specific labor that is essential to the continued maintenance and operations of the university. And at Laurier, we were getting far less than that. And it was also wildly inconsistent between departments. Like my wages were comparable to the wages of unionized universities. However, the unionization efforts at Laurier had been ongoing for 3 years now, and there had been a corresponding pay increase to kind of keep them happy and keep them thinking, oh, maybe we don't need a union because they're giving us pay raises. Whereas my friends at University of Waterloo, I've talked to some of the engineers there and I've said, are you interested in unionizing? And they've said, I don't know, because they're getting paid thousands. They're making really, really good money in their TA ships. Whereas my friends in the environmental sciences and English departments have said, oh, I'm getting paid $16.50 an hour for my TA job, which is just barely a living wage.
Mm-hmm.
Furthermore, universities do make us sign contracts that if we are full-time students working as TAs, we should not seek external employment. So you're really, really bound by the university, and thus they have an obligation to make sure you are supported in the work that they are demanding you do. So our unionization effort was really, really successful. As I say, I came in right at the end, and I feel very, very lucky that I was there when I was, because the unionization effort had been ongoing for 3 years prior to my arrival. So there had been a lot of really, really excellent groundwork laid by some really, really fantastic people. Shout out to all of you on the WLU organized committee. So we were really hitting the ground. Obviously, there were a lot of limits. So we were often waiting in the courtyards outside of large graduate student classes, waiting with a bunch of cards to say like, hello, consider unionizing. And we were just like getting as many cards signed. We were talking to as many different student councils and graduate student committees as we possibly could. and comparing, here's what the health benefits are at unionized universities. Here are what the wages are. Here's what the holiday benefits are. Here's, all of these different very material, very tangible benefits.
Very tangible.
Yeah. And that really engaged people. They were like, oh my gosh, I didn't know. And I was like, yeah. And, a lot of people were operating without a specific contract. They were just told, here's the university professor you're assigned to. And they could basically tell them to do whatever.
So there were no conditions associated with their work then.
It was entirely dependent on the department. It was entirely dependent on the professor, and there was no external body. And actually, this had resulted in a little bit of a crisis for Laurier before, which was the Lindsay Shepherd incident. I don't know if anyone here remembers that particular incident, but I can share the details thereof.
Go ahead.
So the Lindsay Shepherd incident, this was after noted Canadian spokesperson Jordan Peterson had been making headlines for refusing to respect students' preferred pronouns and had been getting a lot of attention in the media. So Lindsay Shepherd was a TA. To be clear, I am not saying this in support of Lindsay Shepherd. It's just an incident that I think is worth drawing attention to in the context of why unions are useful. So Lindsay Shepherd highlighted this story and had a discussion of just like trans rights. Are trans rights human rights? Let's discuss. And of course, a lot of trans students who were in that classroom and trans allies were like, don't love trans rights being, something to be debated for fun in class. And so Lindsay Shepherd had not had that lesson plan approved by the prof, hadn't run it by the prof, and she was teaching on her own that day. So students complained to the prof. The prof basically, as far as I remember, fired her and reprimanded her, and she had no recourses. She had no one else to go to, and the university sided with the professor and basically just suspended her of her position. And she had no recourse, so she immediately went to the press. And the right-wing press immediately seized on this, TA fired for standing up for free speech, et cetera, And there were this was in 2017, which was a bad year, as we all know, for right-wing mobilizing. But there was a massive convergence of right-wingers and alt-right people and so-called free speech defenders in Waterloo. And, even the likes of Faith Goldie and Rebel News, they all showed up. And it became this huge disproportionate thing. And we said, the situation Lindsay Shepherd was in, I'm not siding with Lindsay Shepherd by any means. I do not agree with her views. I do not agree with what she says by any means. However, that is a situation that could have really, really easily been avoided if she had had a third party to go in and support her and advocate for her. If she had had clear stipulations in her contract, if there had been clear terms of her contract that she could refer back to and that the professor could refer back to in terms of what disciplinary action would have been appropriate and what consequences would have been appropriate for that kind of ethical breach.
That really would have been helpful in that instance to everybody actually involved.
It would have made the whole situation so much less of a big deal and would have saved everyone a lot of time and energy.
I think the lack of clarity around teaching assistant jobs, if the teaching assistants don't have a union, actually I experienced that big time myself. At University of Alberta years ago, I was a teaching assistant to 2 different professors, and in one case, the professor didn't assign any work, and in the other case, the professor assigned a lot of work. And I was actually grateful that the first professor didn't assign too much work, because there's enough work in grad studies anyway. So, and there was no union, there was no laying out of expectations. It was just, every once in a while, the professor would contact me and ask me to maybe compose a multiple choice exam, or to grade some papers, or maybe to assist students with some questions and answers related to the material. And I dutifully I wanted a good reference. I wanted his approval. I was also taking a course from him at the time. So, I was under his authority, so to speak. But there was no external source that I could refer to in terms of contracts in terms of hours or wages. There was no resolution for disputes that was available. And then this other professor didn't assign me a thing. And then one day I met him in the elevator, and I was feeling a little bit remiss that maybe we hadn't communicated. And he said, are you feeling guilty for not doing any work for me? And I actually was feeling a little bit guilty. And I was kind of sheepish in the elevator. And he said, don't worry about it. And he just marched on, which is really interesting. Maybe he realized that the other professor was giving me lots of work. I don't know. But again, the situations that we find ourselves in, if you're a teaching assistant or even in other workplaces, can seem very mysterious, right? Like, what is going on? Like, why am I being given lots of work now, whereas I wasn't before, or vice versa? So I think unionization actually clarifies the conditions under which people work and allows them to negotiate for better conditions. And I think that's a wonderful freedom that unions give people. But it's very rare, in my experience, to be talking about this kind of thing on a radio show. Because even the big unions don't have airtime a lot of the time. They don't have access to the so-called free press, which isn't really that free when you come to think of it. It's not free at all, just as we've been talking. There's not really a free marketplace of ideas, and there's not really a free press because the existing press very much supports capitalism and business interests. And if there is a story about unions, then that story kind of breaks when there's a strike or something big is happening. But it's very difficult to get union news unless you get it from the union itself, unless you are unionized. But going from being non-union to union is such a critical process. And it's amazing that, well, as you said, Emily, your situation was an easier one than most people find themselves in. You were able to get people as they were coming out of class. You were able to present them with specific figures that showed the advantages of unionization. You were able to get them on board quite easily. In many workplaces, especially today with people working at home, it's not as easy to do that in-person organizing. And it seems to me that organizing is so absolutely critical to what you and Daniel have been talking about. Do you have any tips for organizing at all? Is there anything that you might say to somebody who would be considering this possibility?
Absolutely. And actually, interestingly, the union bug has been spreading over the road to the University of Waterloo, which, as I said, has been extremely hostile to unionization efforts in the past. There are very, very few unions on campus for faculty and for staff. So they absolutely have a much bigger fight ahead of them. However, I think they remain the only university in Ontario to not have a TA union. As I say, there is ample precedent and ample evidence that TA unions work and are in their best interests. And they have been organizing. So just for a bit of a timeline, our union vote at Laurier happened in December of 2019. Ratification was massively delayed due to the pandemic. So we passed the threshold of the vote very, very marginally. It was a really big fight to get over that threshold. But then we were due to start collective bargaining talks in late March 2020. And of course, then everything exploded. And it was only recently, very, very recently, that the Laurier TAs finalized their first collective agreement with the university. It was this year. So that's been a really, really long time coming. It's been a lot of really difficult negotiation. It's been a lot of really difficult engagement. And keeping the fledgling union alive through social distancing, through online learning, through campuses being closed has been a real challenge. And the University of Waterloo has faced similar challenges in trying to just get a union mobilization effort off the ground in the first place. They've been doing a lot of excellent work. They've been hosting, online socials and, come to get to know your team. And the union has been doing a lot of work, but they've said it's really, really slow going. It's very, very difficult to do during the pandemic because, people are so overwhelmed with Zoom. If you're doing Zoom classes, Zoom assignments, Zoom lectures, you're really tired of Zoom meetings and online socials by the end of the day. So it's been very difficult, but they've had a lot of success with some on-campus organizing now that campus is reopening. So that's incredibly exciting. The campaign at Waterloo, now that they are able to return to campus, has seen a lot of success. There's been a lot of interest in, pub nights, and they've been canvassing around campus as much as they can. But obviously there is a lot of oversight. But it's one of those things where it's a very fortunate campaign in that there's ample evidence of the benefits of unionization and the success of unionization at other campuses. Mm-hmm. And it's starting to become a thing that TAs are going, wait a second, why don't we have a union? It doesn't make sense for us not to have a union because everyone else I know, all of my colleagues at other universities are unionized, and that's going really well for them. They're not seeing any of the negatives, and I'm seeing a lot of very tangible positives. However, I do want to say that, we are white collar workers. This is a white collar union. And I think that's really important to highlight because the challenges we face in unionizing are very, very different than those that manual labor and blue collar workers are facing. The risks we run of being run ragged and underpaid are very, very different than the risks run by less well-regulated industries without union benefit, like being forced to work in dangerous conditions and risk of workplace injury and death. Those are very, very real risks that unions help to mitigate and force companies to meaningfully address. And it is very, very important that we highlight the different levels of risk and reward that come from unionization efforts. And correspondingly, a lot of jobs face a lot more severe pushback from unionization efforts, not only being dismissed, but having their homes, their families, their friends harassed, having union busting campaigns, sabotaging them in really, really serious and dangerous ways. The risks to unionization are not to be understated. We are very, very fortunate in that we did not face that kind of pushback, that kind of union busting effort.
I once asked somebody who had experience in organizing unions, I said, how should one go about organizing a union? And his answer was, very carefully. And I think that is so true. Daniel, I think we need to get back to your essay because this is the Open Mic, a literary journey in the words. And I think we've heard about 3 paragraphs of your paper so far. Let's hear another one.
Next paragraph is profit versus lives. This is not the only way capitalism is a virus. The profit motive led companies to bury internal studies linking a diet high in sugar with diabetes, smoking cigarettes with lung cancer, and industrial carcinogens with multiple forms of cancer. Instead, corporate-funded think tanks and industry groups obfuscated and lobbied against regulation, the pandemics of lung cancer, mesothelioma, other environmentally linked cancers, and diabetes, so-called diseases of old age, would have been largely mitigated if profit did not factor into the equation. Similarly, the most pressing emergency in the world of microbiology, antibacterial resistance, springs from the bowels of capitalism. Although a redistribution of wealth decreased mortality from bacterial infections well before antibiotics were discovered, the new medications did save lives. However, pharmaceutical companies quickly obtained patents and aggressively marketed antibiotics. This essential medicine could be found in toothpaste, gum, and lipstick. Pharmaceutical companies lobbied doctors to prescribe their new antibiotic. Worse, antibiotics became entrenched in industrial agricultural practices where they are commonly added to feed to promote animal growth. Unnecessary usage of antibiotics, driven by profit, selected for resistant microbes, and now antibacterial resistance kills an estimated 700,000 people a year. If we do nothing to address this crisis, it is predicted that resistant microbes will kill 10 million people annually, some 400,000 in Canada by the year 2050.
Scary.
Yeah. While humanity suffers, is Big Pharma redoubling efforts to save us? Not a chance. Despite the pressing danger of antimicrobial resistance, company after company is shuttering their antimicrobial drug pipeline. Only 4 of the top 50 pharmaceutical companies by sales operate an active antimicrobial drug discovery pipeline. Why? It is not profitable. Short courses of antibiotics for acute affections or the development of vaccines for unpredictable pandemics are not as profitable as lifetime treatments for chronic diseases like diabetes or heart disease. This is not a conspiracy. These companies are very open about it. A rule of capitalism is that short-term profits are better than long-term losses. There's no purifying selection in capitalism that roots out companies that place human survival in peril. Just the opposite. More profit is to be had from slashing workers' benefits, selling antibiotics for animal feed, funding disinformation groups, and selling addictive and harmful products. In the pharmaceutical industry, the bigger a company gets, the less it spends on research and development, and the more it spends on lobbying. That is how they increase profit. Not by developing new drugs that help people, but by increasing market share and getting doctors to prescribe their costlier medication instead of alternatives. The profit motive also rules the carbon sector, which is why catastrophic climate change is driving humanity to the brink of extinction. This is why life expectancy in the US is actually now decreasing. The gains of past working class struggles are being erased.
So, Daniel, why are the past gains of the working class being erased? Does anybody know the answer to that question? Because people said capitalism was working because of the high rate of unionization, especially in the 50s and maybe the early 60s. It seems like society was functioning in a much more beneficial way. And unionization has declined in recent years, as I understand it.
It has, absolutely. In Canada, now we're down to about 30%. But like Emily already mentioned, the union bug is spreading. So now we're starting to see a tick up for the first time in a long time. The ebb and flow of the conditions of the working class only makes sense if you see society through the lens of class warfare. The language of, depression and recession and boom and bust that ignores class seems random. Why does our economy constantly go from a bull market to crashing and vice versa? It doesn't make sense until you realize that you have inherent tension between the different classes. What's good for the bosses isn't good for the workers and vice versa. If you look to the 30s, if you look after the post-war period, and really at fairly regular intervals, you see upswells in class consciousness and organizing in response to attacks on the working class by the bosses. And as the workers get more organized, more militant, they organize strikes, general strikes, they're able to rip from the hands of the bosses concessions. They're able to win shorter work days. They're able to win safer working conditions, higher wages. But the reason why the bosses give those in the first place is to placate the workers. That's why the New Deal is actually something very important to understand in the history of working class politics. The New Deal, as ushered in by, FDR in the States and other politicians around the world, was meant to placate the workers, not meant to advantage them. It was actually done to take the wind out of the sails of the workers who are fighting for even more than what they ultimately want. Because when capitalism gets bad, and it inevitably does, workers begin fighting for complete control of the economy, where the workers get to democratically decide how things are run. And that's the scariest thing for the bosses, because then they would lose complete control. And like Emily said, that's why even when unionization drives, if that's being spread on the wind, that's when you might get some raises even without a union. They're basically trying to remove that incredible need to unionize by making it more of a want, by taking away just a bit of the worst parts of it. Our lesson of the New Deal is we need to push all the way through.
I guess we do. Emily, do you have anything to add to that at all?
Well, and also I do want to say unionization in and of itself is not the end goal. The end goal is the restructuring of society so that we are not dependent on wage labor for survival. As Marxists, we often refer to the quote, "From each according to their ability, to each according to their need." Which is to say, we as a society, we know what needs to be done. We know affordable housing needs to be available in our communities. We know we need to reskill and move away from fossil fuel dependent economies and fossil fuel dependent jobs. We need to, invest in childcare and in families and in communities and healthcare. We know what work needs to be done. We need creativity and artistry and expression and a diversity of thought in our cultures. we know the work that needs to be done, but the work that needs to be done is not the work that is profitable. And so unions are a step towards building a more equitable society and a tool for us to push for better conditions. However, they are only a stopgap measure on the longer journey to a better world, a better society, a society where we work for what is needed and we can support the people who can contribute what they can. This is the world we are striving for.
I'm wondering if I can play devil's advocate here just for a second with you both. Because this is the kind of thing that I hear when I'm advancing the kinds of arguments that you're making. People say socialism hasn't worked and therefore the only alternative is capitalism. Have you heard that before at all?
Of course. It's one of the most common retorts, and people have different countries they like to point to. First, I think we need to start the discussion off with an accurate and honest analysis of how capitalism is faring. And capitalism, I would also argue, is working according to its own internal set of rules, but it's not working according to the needs of humans. And that's undeniable when you have more houses than people on this planet, yet you have people still living in the streets. And we make enough and grow enough food every year to feed twice the population over, yet you have people starving to death. So at this point, capitalism is also a failed system. Yet the retort to, socialism has failed in the past. Well, at least our analysis is socialism in one country can never succeed. So we're fighting for an international socialist movement, an international working class, and the alliance between the international oppressed and exploited. That's the only way to fully deal with this wretched system once and for all.
Wow. Okay.
I will also say a lot of the things that people point to as failures of communist and socialist governments, the horrors that people experienced there does need to be acknowledged. Absolutely. There was incredible violence. There was incredible harm, displacement, very poor decisions, and warfare that was completely unnecessary. And I don't point to those necessarily as failures of communism, because the capitalist system does the exact same thing. The capitalist system exploits. The capitalist system is incredibly violent. There are so many problems that are not contradictory to the statement that we need to be striving for a better world and that socialism gives us a roadmap to get there. The problems inherent are problems of power and corruption. The problems are ones inherent in hierarchy. When you have a small minority of people making vast, far-reaching decisions for a broad majority of people without their knowledge, without their input, this is where harm happens. People in power tend to think that power organizes itself correctly and that they deserve to be in power. We see this time and time again. And so anytime there is a consolidation of power, power will try to reinforce itself and protect itself. And that is where we see violence. That is where we see state violence and prisons and disenfranchisement and forced displacement. When we are able to actively consult with a broad base of people, when we are able to get input from the people and actually meet their needs and figure out how to build a society that meets the vast majority of people's needs, that is the path to liberation.
To
Absolutely.
each according to his or her ability, to each according to his or her need. And I think Karl Marx said that, right? So, wow. So you're actually in the process of imagining how a new kind of socialistic society would work that would be more inclusive and actually more socialistic than societies in the past, it sounds like to me.
Yeah, we need to break with the Stalinist tradition. Our party, we're opposed to Stalinism, but that's an important conversation to have to show people that we're willing to acknowledge history. I think when people bring up that argument about, socialism failed in the past, some people do it in bad faith and they'll never be convinced otherwise. But I would argue that most of the people are just concerned about, are you aware of these pitfalls? Are you aware of these things? They don't know what to think because they know that the system today doesn't work well, but they've been made to fear the unknown even more. And that's a really great strategy for the ruling class. The ruling class doesn't even need to convince people that the system that they're living in today is good, just that maybe the alternative is not even any better and it's not worth the struggle. Stalinism replicated a lot of the worst things of capitalism with a top-down bureaucratic approach that deprived the masses really of the say in their own lives. And that's not what we're fighting for.
Wow. Emily?
We do not think the world will be better when we're in charge. That is not what we are thinking. We are thinking the world will be better when people, oppressed people, and working people are able to control the material conditions of their lives. We are fighting for that, but that doesn't mean we are fighting for power.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love what you're saying.
What is the solution? Socialism. Just like mass mobilization led to real material gains for the working class in the 1800s, which directly led to improved nutrition and less death due to pestilence, it's time to rise up around the world, reclaim our industries, and put them to work for us, not for the capitalists who leech off of social production. We can learn from the shortcomings of past movements. History teaches that simply relying on legislation or on reform of capitalism results only in temporary wins, which are restricted by borders and maintain the colonial and capitalist state responsible for global poverty and its pandemics. In capitalist society, the ruling class controls the means of production, but what they lack is a superiority in numbers. That's why it is vital to mobilize the masses with the vision of workers' control and workers' democracy in mind, for workers of the world to unite. When the moment comes, and with many capitalist catastrophes on the horizon, and maybe soon, we seek to elevate the working class to the role of rulers of society. It is absurd to expect capitalists to play politely, to put the interests of the vast majority first. Have no illusions in phony class alliance with them. Capitalism is the virus. We must inoculate ourselves against corporate propaganda and wipe the system of exploitation and oppression off the face of the earth.
Wonderfully said, very clearly said, and articulately said, and compellingly said, Daniel. Wow, there is so much to your short essay. It's very short, but it's very impactful. Thank you so much. And thank you both so much for your wonderful comments today and for articulating so well the socialist cause, and the cause for unionization, the cause for workers' rights, the cause for health and wellness in a system that is fair and equitable for all. That's wonderful. It's very inspiring. I really appreciate it. You've been listening to The Open Mic, a literary journey into words. We've been talking with Daniel Terade and Emily Steers, who have both been on the forefront of Socialist Action, an organization that is promoting socialism in Canadian society and around the world. Can you say just a little bit about the party that you are connected with?
Anybody listening, Socialist Action is active from coast to coast to coast. We have members from Victoria to New Brunswick. We have branches around the country. No matter where you're listening, there's a way for you to join the struggle. We need to come together. When we're isolated, we have virtually no power. But when we come together in organizations with a clear vision for what we want to build, then anything becomes possible.
If you would like to hear more from us, Daniel and I do have a podcast together. It is called The Red Review, and it is bringing a socialist perspective to current events. And we have a lot of really fantastic discussions with really interesting guests and covering angles that you won't often hear in the mainstream news media. So please check us out, and I hope you enjoy.
Thank you both once again. And now, to conclude our program, here's Emily Steers herself once again, singing a great Union classic.
Now there once was a Union maid. She never was afraid of the goons and the ginks and the company finks and the deputy sheriffs who made the raid. She went to the Union Hall, where meeting it was called. And when the boys would come to her, oh, this is what she'd say. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union till the day I die. Now this Union maid was wise to the tricks of the company's spies. She'd take the dare, she didn't care. She'd always organize the guys, and she always got her way. When she'd ask for better pay, she'd show her card to the National Guard. Honey, this is what she'd say. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the Union. I'm sticking to the Union till the day I die. Now you women who want to be free, just take a tip from me. Join your hand with a union friend into the 21st century. As Angela Davis found, we're all together bound. Let race and class and gender join to stand our common ground. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the Union. sticking to the union. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union till the day I die. One more time. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. Oh, you can't